Hello and welcome to Israel Cyber Week and securing the ICT supply chain from cybersecurity threats. My name is John Miller. I'm Senior Vice President for Policy and General Counsel at ITI, the Information Technology Industry Council. I lead our Trust, Data, and Technology Policy team, including our work globally on cybersecurity, supply chain security and resiliency, privacy and data protection, artificial intelligence, and several other emerging technology policy and data issues. I would like to start by thanking the U.S. Chamber of Commerce for inviting me to speak and for putting together this event, as well as our hosts at Tel Aviv University and also our sponsors, NTT and OPSWAT, and our panelists, of course, and the audience here. Just a few more words about ITI in the context of this issue. We represent 80 of the world's leading technology companies, truly representing the breadth of the tech sector, including hardware, software, services, data companies, lots of other companies as well, really the full breadth of the sector. Most ITI companies service the global market via complex supply chains in which products are developed, made and assembled in multiple countries, and we service customers across governments worldwide and the full range of global industry sectors. So we acutely understand the importance of securing the global ICT supply chain as not only a global business imperative for our companies and our customers, but is also critical to our collective security. I've also been honored to serve as a co-chair of the ICT Supply Chain Risk Management Task Force in the United States, representing the IT sector since the task force's inception. I know that there have been some task force focused panels at previous Israel Cyber Weeks. This is my first time here, so I'm happy to be carrying on the tradition of at least talking a little bit about our work. So I did just want to say, in the 4.5 years of the task force's existence, we have built it into, at least in the US, the preeminent public-private partnership on this critical issue. And we are expecting to release our latest products in the coming months, including providing guidance on a hardware bill of materials framework for supply chain risk management, as well as a software assurance buyer's guide. Not coincidentally, those two products, I think, deal with the topics of transparency and trust, two issues that I know we're going to get into more on the panel. The task force underscores the importance of public-private partnerships as an essential mechanism for addressing our shared supply chain and broader cybersecurity challenges. So it's great that we have a combined panel of government and industry speakers here today as well. Finally, I did want to just provide a few more observations before I hand it over to our keynote speakers to kind of set the scene a little bit. Securing global supply chains it's been an issue for a long time for a lot of folks, particularly in the ICT sector. But over the past few years, it really does seem like the conversation has changed. And supply chain security and resiliency, for a whole variety of reasons, has emerged as it's really a top-tier issue for governments. At least from my vantage point, it's resulted in more supply chain policy making initiatives, not only across the U.S. government, that's where I'm based, but globally. And in my view, there really are two key developments that are driving a lot of the increased policy focus on this issue. First, managing risks to global supply chains has always been complex, but our increasingly connected global ICT infrastructure, it really truly is powering every segment of the economy. I think I don't know what the latest numbers are, but I'm pretty sure we've certainly surpassed 20 billion connected devices. And that just kind of helps underscore the vast scope of the challenge. We also see, as well as criminal threats, which are a constant, increases in nation-state threats. It's a greater part of the conversation than it was certainly 10 years ago. So it's implicating not only national security, but also economic security, competitiveness as well. And then second, the rise of 5G networks and kind of the data-centric world that they will help power, I think, has really magnified supply chain security challenges and anticipated risks, driving governments to more intensely focus on the issue. Specifically, the increased speed and volume of data that is flowing through networks, empowering data-driven innovations such as artificial intelligence, raises a significant questions for a lot of governments, in particular regarding regarding data access. Again, that implicate national security and also individual privacy, technological leadership, economic competitiveness, and of course, cybersecurity. So all these developments are driving an evolving approach and perspective on the supply chain issue, which I look forward to exploring with our great speakers and panelists today. So I am now going to yield the podium to our keynote speaker. I guess I should give a brief introduction first before I do so. So Ian McCormick is the Deputy Director for Government Cyber Resilience within the UK National Cybersecurity Centre, which is part of GCHQ. He is responsible for overseeing the security advice and assistance provided to improve the cyber resilience of the UK public sector, including Her Majesty's government, defence, health, local government, and the devolved administrations of the UK. And it's actually His Majesty now, I think I've been reminded. Sorry, I'm American. Apologies, everyone. Anyway, so with that auspicious introduction, I will yield the floor to Ian. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, John, and thank you to the Chamber for having us today. Yeah, I'm just going to make a few remarks just by way of setting some context on the supply chain challenge from a UK perspective before we engage in some questions in the fireside chat. When I thought about this, I thought maybe you should make some remarks about like why this challenge is so important for us, and why do we have so many of you in the room today? And like maybe it's really quite self-evident, but we are critically dependent upon our supply base, and that's a whole range of suppliers, and for a whole bunch of different reasons as well. We're obviously critically dependent on the supply base to deliver the core business, the core functions, be that government, be that industry, but we're also critically reliant upon the supply base to help us defend against the threat. We certainly can't do the kind of defense that we need alone, and we need that help from industry, from our partners, in order to be cyber resilient. Not just the UK, but all of us in partnership. But the topic of supply chain, it's massively broad and there's huge amounts of complexity, and I find that we need to cut through some of that complexity in order that we can start to take some steps to make effective progress on how we secure the supply chain. So for example, we need to think a little bit about what some of our overall objectives are with regard to supply chain, as the interventions that we might make as a community will vary. So for example, one objective might be to ensure that companies as part of our supply chain are themselves cyber secure. And that's really important, obviously, when they're holding our equity, but there's also a broader societal benefit for helping those companies be more cyber secure. But we need to ensure that the services that are built and the products that are built and developed for us, for us in government, for us as companies, are themselves cyber resilient, that they have security baked in by default, and that they are secure by design. And we hear quite a lot of those sort of phrases over the course of Cyber Week. For some suppliers, particularly managed service providers, there's some particular considerations because of the reliance that we rely on the technology solutions, the vital role that they play in keeping us secure. And then there's broader national level concerns. So for example, considerations including the national ownership of particular countries around the world, and how that might align to our values and our objectives as a nation as well. So some really, really broad objectives. We need to be really clear across that. The threat, the threat to organizations that manifests through the supply chain can, of course, be incredibly severe. But from my experience, actually, some of the threat sometimes it's direct, sometimes it's targeted, but quite often it's actually incidental. And we see this a lot with ransomware. We see organizations within the supply chain subject to ransomware attack that has onward impact into really, really critical services. And we saw this in the UK just before Christmas with an attack against a company called Advance that provides services into our national health system. Almost certainly that organization was hit by ransomware for financial, as a financial motivation from the threat. It wasn't to target health, but nonetheless, it had a massive impact on health. So, so from a threat point of view, we need to sort of like think quite broadly. We need to think quite broadly as well. So, knowing your supply chain is a huge challenge, and we heard the remarks about hardware bill of materials. I think super interesting. We definitely follow up on that, but it's really hard to know your supply chain, especially once you get below tier one, below those top tier sort of suppliers. Maybe, this is a point of debate, whether it's even fully possible. I don't know. I'm sure we've all got examples of how hard this is, but one I sort of reflect on is for example, when the vulnerability in Log4j was discovered, it was really difficult trying to understand where did you find that vulnerability, where did you find that library, and it was even harder when that library was embedded within software products that then you're using yourself as an organization. So it's really, really, really challenging, and some of that challenge is magnified when you talk about the software supply chain. So just a little bit about some of the future things that we're looking at as well, because this is really important. There's been a lot of talk this week so far about future tech, and about how do we embed security into that. I think when we're looking at future technology opportunities, we're looking at all of these these whizzy potential future applications of AI, for example, that's going to change the world apparently. We must make sure that we don't make the mistakes of the past. We must make sure that we're baking in security from the outset, and that we are not putting that burden on consumers to retrofit security or to, sorry, it's a bit feedbacky, or to have to take difficult actions in order to make themselves cyber secure. We must embed that from the outset. So that philosophy of secure by design is incredibly important for us. The other thing with some of these new technologies as well is some of the considerations, some of the security issues might be a little bit different as well. Traditionally, we focused on confidentiality, integrity, availability, but when you're considering some of these new applications, we need to start to think about things like ethics, which are really interesting, like fail-safe. How do we hold trust in those kind of applications? So there's a whole bunch of new considerations for us in that whole future tech supply chain dynamic. So that's all I was going to say, just by way of some introductory remarks to how we're currently thinking about supply chain. But look forward to having a discussion, John. Thanks.
Excellent. Well, thanks, Ian, for those remarks. And I see we've got a standing room only crowd. Very, very impressive. There are some seats in here if folks would like to sit down. So, the first question I wanted to ask you, how does the National Cybersecurity Center approach the assessment and management of cybersecurity risks in the ICT supply chain? Are there specific frameworks or guidelines that organizations can follow, whether or not produced by the UK government or elsewhere, that you can point to?
I think as the question indicates, there are many frameworks out there. There's an awful number of frameworks that you can use, and I think it's really important that when you're considering any frameworks that you're going to use to address the supply chain problem, that you're choosing something that is consistent with and supports your organization's risk management approach. I've seen challenges across organizations where they're trying to do something different that doesn't augment itself really neatly with the existing organizational structure. So I think that's probably the first thing is make sure that whatever approach you're choosing and you're picking, it's something that fits with what you're already doing as an organization and the approach. What we've done from the NCSC is we've published guidance relatively recently. It's got an overall approach, and like much of our guidance, it's based around principles and recommendations rather than a sort of a strict framework as such. And we've published the overall approach to supply chain security. We've also developed and published some learning modules, and all of that's available on our website if anyone's interested. It's ncsc.gov.uk. And the approach that we advocate is, firstly, you need to understand your risk context. You need to understand what's important for you as an organisation, who are your decision makers, indeed what are your risk management frameworks that you already use as an organisation. I would recommend that you prioritise the crown jewels, if you like, that which is most important, and put the effort into understanding and managing the supply chain risk associated with the things that are most critical to your organisation or to your function or your mission, whatever that happens to be. And that might be around information, it might be around service, it might be around privilege rights, and so on. We sometimes find it helpful to establish profiles that apply to different organisations according to the level of risk that they might face the organisation. It's quite a practical thing to do. We publish some advice around that. And then apply that approach. Apply it to new relationships, educate the team, educate the commercial team in your organisations, integrate into existing contracts, continue, improve, and so on and so forth. But actually, in terms of risk management approaches, I mean, quite often we sort of step through those kind of classic approaches, and they tend to work quite well with the sort of traditional contracting with a supplier type model. I think there's something we need to be aware of, which is how do we need to modify that? How do we need to think about supply chain security when we're perhaps thinking about commoditized technologies, highly commoditized technologies, where your relationship with the vendor is perhaps a bit different, because I'm not in traditional sense sort of setting out the requirements of the contract that's then sort of responded to. We've an approach, and we've advocated this approach for quite some time in NCSC, which is around principles. So, for example, around cloud services, we've developed and published a number of principles that helps consumers of a service to reason about what their security needs are, and then they can take that understanding of need and then apply it to what's available in the marketplace and do that matching. So a little bit of a different approach there.
Well, thanks. And you've kind of anticipated my next question, a little bit. You were just talking about cloud. You mentioned AI in your opening remarks. It's hard to have any session on anything that doesn't mention AI these days, right? I mentioned 5G and IoT and AI as well. I mean, one of the things about technology is that it continues to change and evolves, right? So we have all these so-called emerging technologies, some of which are frankly becoming foundational, arguably already. I mean, but how, and again, you said a little bit about it, but how does NCSC stay ahead of the curve of these evolving cybersecurity threats in the ICT supply chain? Again, are there specific areas of concern or focus as you look ahead?
Yeah, I mean, it's really important for us. We invest a lot of time, effort, resource to understand technologies, to participate in the international flora that's developing the standards for those new technologies. And obviously, it's not something that we do in isolation. We work very, very closely with our partners, globally, and also, critically with industry. I mean, fundamentally, it's industry that's to design and specify and build those technologies. I see our role as NCSC in terms of the risk management picture for new technologies being really one of how do we understand technology, how do we understand the implications that technology would have to cybersecurity, and to, if you like, to cut through some of the hype about technology sometimes, and to give clear, objective advice, both to consumers, also to decision makers. And we talked about AI all week, and no doubt for the rest of the week, for example. But it's really important, for example, to narrow the focus down a little bit. And we focus quite a lot on the security of AI itself, and how do we use AI as network defenders? How might the threat use AI? So we try and cut through it in that way. And another example is quantum. It's another one of the sort of the buzzwords that we're hearing a lot about. And again, so in terms of cutting through the noise, the kind of role we might take would be to be able to help answer questions such as, how concerned should we be about the development in the future of a viable quantum computer, for example? I think the short answer is don't panic, actually. But we try and cut through some of that so that we're giving good, sound, technically technically sound advice to decision makers. As you said as well, John, some of the things that sort of bundled up with emerging tech it's not emerging as a technology, but it might be emerging in how we risk manage it. And so, we still need to be thinking through how do we use and consume some of these technologies in a way that still supports our overall organizational risk management objectives. And that's really important, of course, across government, across the industry, and so on and so forth.
Thanks. And yeah, I think you're probably spot on to flag quantum as the next AI or what have you, and maybe to not be worried as long as we have quantum the quantum proof cryptography work keeps up anyway, right? So with the increasing reliance on global ICT supply chains, what steps should organizations take to assess and mitigate risks associated with third-party suppliers and vendors, right? I mean, it's kind of the whole supply chain. When we start talking about third-party suppliers and vendors, it goes several layers down, really, right, for the ICT supply chain. Are there specific best practices, due diligence processes, tools, even that NCSC recommends?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really tough one. We touched a little bit about that understanding of the supply chain, particularly below tier one suppliers, and I think that challenge is just magnified when you're talking about the global supply chain and how far do you go in terms of trying to understand that global supply chain and what it means for you. Do you have, for example, particular concerns about about countries as well? That becomes very complex. I mean, one of the things that one of the comments I'd make on this and sort of remarks, I was sort of thinking a little bit about the questions in advance and picking up particularly the sort of the global nature of global ICT supply chains. And one sort of thought that sort of strikes me is actually even so, for many organisations, the kind of things we still need to worry about are the traditional things still, configuration, managing access, are you vulnerable to ransomware, rather than maybe sort of the geopolitical angle that's associated with global. So I think that's quite important to position the concern of the global nature of the ICT supply chain with all of the other risks that you face, as an organisation themselves. I mean, obviously, something that's been very current across many of our nations, certainly has been in the UK, is there are some technology components or products, there are some software apps originating from particular nations, in particular from China, that present us as a particular challenge. And what I'll say about sort of like those elements of the global ICT supply chain is, it has to be a risk balance case. There is no way of saying the risk is okay or not okay in a really generic sense. You have to really think about the kind of functions that services, technology, apps are providing, what kind of access they have to data services, what kind of privilege they have, how important it is for you as an organisation, put all of that together to really understand the risk picture and make some effective decisions. But it's a really tough domain.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. And I mean, it's a cliche at this point, but actually looking at things like access to data and these other risk factors is so important, because if everything is critical, then nothing is critical, right? Again, you've probably heard that before as well. So looking ahead, and we've kind of looked ahead a little bit already, but I mean, what trends or developments do you foresee, or even are you in particular focused on looking ahead at the convergence, really, particularly cybersecurity and the ICT supply chain landscape? What should organizations and policymakers prioritize to ensure a secure and trustworthy ICT ecosystem? And I mean, I guess maybe even just that, you were talking a little bit about the really stressing the global landscape just now. Is there anything more that the UK is doing or that government should be doing, working together on this challenge too, or with companies?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I mean, I think there's so much more we can be doing together as like-minded nations. I mean, and a really good example, I think, is the necessity for sort of values like driven democracies to be collaborating team working together on how we define, how we implement sort of standards for new technologies. 5G was mentioned a moment ago, but looking ahead, perhaps 60 other technologies, we need to ensure that the kind of values that we hold dear are baked into the sort of standards that are defining those technologies for the future. And that's a really clear area, I think, where collaboration is going to be, is going to be super important. I think one of the trends as well that I see is really important for us, and again, this is a theme I've heard a lot about so far over here in Tel Aviv, is about the role of data. How can data help us to make better decisions? How can data inform us more consistently about where we have vulnerabilities, about what the impact is of the interventions that we make on our cybersecurity risk, rather than it being entirely subjective. So I think that's an area that's going to make a difference, and it's one that we're investing quite heavily in as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's such a great point, and probably a good one to end on. I mean, I think we think of data as part of the an increased threat vector in the supply chain conversation, but you're saying it's part of the solution, of course, as well, to really leverage that. So that's great. So
absolutely.
Ian, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
So I'm going to get up now, and we're going to add some panelists and chairs, and I will introduce the panelists while we're doing that. So, okay, ooh, wow, that's louder than the handheld mic, sorry. So again, while the chairs are coming out, let me just briefly introduce the panelists. I'll just go with name, title, and organization, and then they can certainly share more about their backgrounds when they make their interventions. So we have Emma Green, Deputy Director for Cyber Resilience at the Department for Science, Innovation, and Technology in Great Britain. We have Mihoko Matsubara, the Chief Cybersecurity Strategist for NTT, and I will be calling her Miho, which is, I think, how she likes to be referred to. We have Shani Bar-Niv, Head of Regulation and Supply Chain Risk Management at the Israel National Cyber Directorate. Then we have Trevor Rudolph, the Vice President for Global Digital Policy and Regulation at Schneider Electric. And then we have Dineshwar Sani, the Director for Global Product Security at Visa. So panelists, please join on stage. And am I supposed to be taking a seat or standing? What have we decided? Okay. All right, just checking. Maybe I'll use this, and we have 3 mics between 5 panelists, so you guys will have to share. Okay, so the panel topic, supply chain security, seems to become a bigger issue every year. What makes supply chain risk unique among all the cyber risks an organization faces? Why is it important to focus specifically on this issue? Miho, let's start with you. If you want to grab a mic.
Hi. So I think that to take a look at the importance of ICT supply chain risk management, we have to have 2 perspectives. So first one is cyber attacks causes a collateral damage on the different critical infrastructure sectors. And the second one is sustainable and also stable procurement of ICT services and products. So I'm now working at a critical infrastructure company based in Japan. And now we all learned how important to take a look at and also how serious the cyber attacks can be on the collateral damage, looking at the colonial pipeline incident caused by a ransomware attack. So even though that the attackers were financially motivated and they only attacked one single company in the United States, but what happened? It led to a serious damage to national security. So we all learned in a very painful ways we have to get ready, and also that the importance to have a cyber exercise on your own, but also you have to do interagency and the interconnected cyber exercise between the different critical infrastructure companies, namely like energy, telecommunication, electricity, and also transportation, something like that. And then the second perspective we need to have is a sustainable and also stable procurement. And it is especially important in this globally high tension age in the 2023s. And as a critical infrastructure company, now we have to take a look at the trusted suppliers and vendors, and also that we have to make sure that not to only to procure certain technologies, but you also have to make sure that are they trusted enough. So they will continue to give us maintenance and services in the future, in a foreseeable future. So in that way, then I think that all the critical infrastructure companies, not only in Japan, but also in Israel, United States, or Great Britain, we have to be mindful about that. Thank you.
Thanks, Miho. Shani, I think you wanted to get in on this one as well.
Yeah, so I would like to say that in the recent years, we saw that there are many attacks that have been through the supply chain for organizations. And the obvious thing that we know that the organization is trying to protect itself, secure itself first, and they don't think about the gates that they have, the entrance through the suppliers. So I just saw a few articles that I want to present for you. Sorry. In the UK, 7% of the organizations are actually securing the supply chain, which means more than 90% of the organizations are not secured. So this is something that is a very big issue that we need to put it under the spotlight. Another thing I wanted to say, the supply chain is not new for us. In the past, there have been several attacks that are very famous and familiar for you. I guess kind of Stuxnet, if someone heard about it, 2010. So when the worm harmed the Iranian nuclear program, and after that, of course, destroyed the centrifuges. And what brought the supply chain under the spotlight today was according to the attack that happened on the U.S. government, the federal, that SolarWinds, if you heard about it, I think it was in 2020, March 2020, when it happened. So this what brought the issue to a very big deal now that everyone is considering the supply chain as a very important thing to notice. So the thing that I wanted to say, it's not new for us that the supply chain is a very easy vector for attacks. But the thing is that this years we saw an awful maybe, increase of the attacks that happens through the last years. Just in Sonotype that showed in a report that they had that more than 600% been between. I'm sorry. Oh, sorry. Okay. Okay. Between 2021 to 2022, it's been more than 600% of attacks through the supply chain, which is like enormous size of this thing. Anyway, so this is very crucial for us to put the spot on this issue.
Thanks, Shani. Any other panelists want to weigh in on anything they just heard or this issue on the importance of supply chain? Yeah, sure. Go ahead. Finish
You
one.
asked us to introduce ourselves. I'll quickly do introduction because it's relevant. Not because I'm one of the panelists, but because I came from business onto engineering and then cybersecurity. So I'm looking at cyber and supply chain from a business perspective as well as from a development or engineering perspective. So, Ian mentioned about Log4j and Shani mentioned about our wonderful experience in SolarWinds, and having braved through those experiences from the boots on the ground view, it's important that we all know that whether it's Heartbleed or whether it's Capital One or there was another breach in one of the credit reporting agencies, which they kind of they knew about the vulnerability, but they did not act upon it, and everybody knows about what happened afterwards. So I just say, outside this auditorium, there's a quote that really stuck with me. They struck the right note in there, that the righteous are the establishment of the future, are forever, right? So you are as strong as your weakest link. So one small library is going to bring you down. One small back door that developers build, whether it's your hardware, whether it's your software, the engineer wants to fix the vulnerability quickly, because we've been given a lot of information, as Ian mentioned, about context as well as prioritization. So as engineers, I want to fix as soon as possible. But given the weakest link analogy, it's important for all of us to make sure whether you are a producer, whether you're a developer, you're an engineer, right from the threat model perspective down to the consumer, although consumers are not considered as a part of the supply chain, but I think consumers become as an important part of the chain because they participate in DDoS attacks. So we have to kind of think about where, when, and how, and most importantly, not only just regulations. So we have a saying in my shop where it's make security simple. Security is not only a team sport, but also in some cases a contact sport, like rugby or football, American football, where you have to convince the product managers, you have to convince the business, you have to convince the engineers to fix that vulnerability, to make sure you're doing the right thing the first time. Shifting left is not that important, because starting right is more important. Thank you.
Thanks.
John, I may jump in here.
Yes, and please, Trevor.
If I may, I
please.
think going back to your original question, one of the things that's unique about supply chain security versus traditional cybersecurity is, Shani already pointed out the ecosystem play, right? You've got a lot more to protect. I would also say that from a supply chain security standpoint, it really reflects the state of geopolitical affairs. So you can have a completely secure operation or completely trustworthy developers in a particular country. They're doing things in a very secure manner, but because you're in that country and you're using those developers, it affects your reputation in another country. And that's, I would say, something that is unique to this particular area and a particular challenge for suppliers who are globally distributed by nature. So it's something that we have to think about. I would even argue have to get over as a world population, right? Because globalization is not going away, even though we hope or think it might. It's not. Deglobalization is actually quite expensive. So we've got to reconcile these various points in the supply chain security context.
Thanks, Trevor. Foreshadowing the trust question coming up later. Thank you. Okay, so I mean, and I think we got into this a little bit in the conversation with Ian, but the supply chain security conversation, at least from my perspective, it really seems to have evolved over the past few years. Previously very focused on ICT hardware, but really now we're talking a lot about software. We're talking a lot about managed services, data, threats to the digital supply chain. Emma, I know you're doing a lot of work in this area. Can you provide us with kind of the UK context on this issue? Describe your work, regarding digital service providers, software, and procurement. Any relevant legislation or policy work you have underway you want to reference? That'll be great too. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thanks, John. You'll have to shut me up. I don't want to.
We've got time, so go ahead.
Just to revisit some of the stats, I think in terms of the context. So Shani sort of mentioned a UK cyber breaches report, which we publish annually. I think we've been doing it since 2014-15. And this year, for the first year, actually, over half of the large organisations that were surveyed now say that they are managing their immediate supply chain risks. So whilst 55% of our largest companies saying that they now manage their cyber risks for the first time isn't necessarily a good news story, it is a lot further than we have been previously. So, there is grounds for hope. When you look at the business population as a whole, of which obviously the majority are SMEs or small and medium-sized enterprises, that figure goes down to 13%. So obviously that challenge becomes magnified. And when you look beyond that first tier of suppliers, it goes down to 8%. So as Ian said, even the expectation that organisations should be able to look beyond that first tier is tremendously difficult. So I guess we need to acknowledge that barrier to start with and think about what we can do to reduce the risk on behalf of the economy as a whole, which is the kind of background which informs a lot of the work that we're doing from a UK perspective. So within the UK, we have the Network Information Systems Regulations, which we transposed from an EU directive back in 2018. And this forms the cyber regulation that underpins a lot of our critical sectors. And within the scope of those regulations are digital service providers. So online search engines, marketplaces, and cloud service providers. And for the first time, we are looking at placing minimum security requirements on managed service providers and also bringing those in scope of our NIST regulations, recognising how important that sector is as an attack vector by virtue of the huge access that they have across multiple organisations. So thinking about that regulatory coverage and thinking about the levers that we have to place expectations on those organisations is the sort of first tier of our ambition here. Then we're looking beyond those operators of essential services that are in scope of our NIST regulations and looking at whether we can amend legislation to also bring in scope critical dependencies. So that is asking operators to identify who are their critical suppliers, who is critical to their supply chain, and looking at what we need to do to ask similar requirements or set equivalent minimum standards to those critical dependencies. And then Donnie talked about software. We are also starting to think about what we need to do to take a holistic policy response to software vulnerabilities and thinking about where software introduces risk across its life cycle, all the way from secure software development environments to thinking about the security expectations that we are placing on software vendors. We did a kind of consultation and asked industry for views over the last few months. And what we heard really clearly was that there are 3 areas that we should be focusing on. One, about setting out what good looks like. So there is a plethora of guidance out there, both within the UK and internationally. How can we consolidate that and bring that together so that it is accessible and simple? Secondly, how can we increase transparency? So, there is obviously a lot of talk about the role that SBOMs can play here, but what more can we do to kind of raise transparency and equip buyers and others with the information to make informed buying decisions? And the third sort of tranche is thinking about where accountability sits. So actually, who feels the burden of responsibility on both adhering and communicating that they are adhering to those minimum security requirements. So we see software as a really important kind of space that we need to start moving more into from a policy perspective. And then lastly, around equipping organisations, so looking at what we can do to provide standard contractual clauses to support organisations to think about their risk posture and to think about what a proportionate approach might be in terms of their expectations that they are placing on their suppliers, both at the point of procurement, but also importantly in terms of ongoing contractual relationships. Obviously, questions around security don't end at the point of procurement. We need to make sure that that is an ongoing conversation, and equipping organisations with sort of best practice guidance about what they might be asking for is a really important part of the picture. So I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Emma. Sure. Dineshwar, I mean, it would be great. I know you want to provide you've already let everyone know you've got more of an operational and business perspective on software.
Yeah,
Share what you'd like,
Thank you.
please.
Real quick, because Ian and Emma have been talking about regulation, but from the boots on the ground view, regulation is very important. One of the things that we have to do as an ecosystem is because if you look at it, the ecosystem has vendors, it has developers, producers, it has gatekeepers, builders, maintainers. We have to work together as regulation comes in based on the requirements that we have. As we go deeper into what needs to be done, one of the things that I think from the operational perspective that really has worked well in organizations that I've worked at is training boots on the ground. Security is everybody's responsibility. It should not be just a cliche that we all talk about, but also ingrained. This place has been known to have security testing tooling and all that. Hey, we're going to help you shift left, find and fix vulnerabilities earlier. But one of the key things that I think where the future lies is how to code or build security. How I can change my developer's mindset or builder's mindset. And most importantly, have the business understand that your product, if it's secure, it has a unique selling proposition. Thank you.
Thanks. And we'll certainly circle back to software later in the panel. But did anyone else want to throw anything on the table related to software, data, digital supply chain threats at this time? If not, I will move on. Okay, so Shani, let's go back to you. What best practices, tools, measures, methodologies, are used to protect the supply chains of organizations here in Israel? Like, what are you pointing folks to?
Okay, so when we realized that organizations are not protecting themselves through the supply chain, INCD, Israel National Cyber Directorate, decided to support all the organizations and to develop a comprehensive, anonymously free and accessible solution by building a methodology for the market. So this is, of course, to increase the chance of the herd immunity in the Israeli market. So the methodology is built from cross-cutting requirements as well as models that are based on the supplier occupation as OT, security, operation technology. We have software development, remote access, and so on that are built specifically for every supplier that they're working on in the technology, the ICT supply chain. So the new methodology that we built, published on December 22, that provides a solution for small and medium suppliers either. Because the last methodology we had been with a very, very expensive and very, and took it, and made the supplier have a very, lots of investment financially in this methodology to implement it. And we decided to change it. And today we have a methodology that reduced the financial burden like a lot. So they can implement it with three levels of risks and 2 certifications that we have. One certification way that we have is through a compliance institute. And the other one is a self-declaration that we're using. It can do it, the organization can do it itself, or it can use the certified supplier inspector on behalf of the INCD. That the INCD created a training for it to certify those supplier inspectors. INCD is recommending all the entire Israeli market to implement the methodology to secure themselves. And I must say, like from our experience, we learned that there must be a gradual methodology, because we wanted to make the methodology easy to implement in the suppliers and also be comprehensive and effective. Thank you.
Thanks, Shani. Any other panelists want to weigh in on methodologies, tools, best practices, standards for managing supply chain risk or third-party risk? Yes, Emma.
I was just going to talk about the cyber assessment framework, which we have in the UK, which is very closely aligned to the US NIST framework. It's an outcome-based framework, which is what underpins the requirements within our NIST regulations, but we are also exploring expanding it similarly as a kind of voluntary tool to those beyond regulated sectors. And we think that that is a really important approach, because not only is it outcome-based, so it allows organisations the flexibility to demonstrate how they are meeting the requirements rather than taking an overly prescriptive approach. But there is also the ability for NCSE and the experts that sit within that organisation to support sectors in setting out where the baseline should sit across different sectors. So recognising that the risk profile isn't necessarily consistent, and that what we are asking of different sectors should align with their own sort of requirements according to their own risk management practices. So actually we think that the cyber assessment framework is a really important tool for supplier risk management. And as I mentioned before, sort of bringing in critical dependencies in the scope of the NIST regulations will expand the reach and scope of the CAF to suppliers more generally.
Thanks, Emma. So let's move on to the topic of trust. I know Trevor is very excited to talk about trust. I think you often hear trust mentioned in these supply chain conversations, right? We talk about the importance of trustworthy ICT, the concept of trusted suppliers. So kind of just to start off here, and I'll go to you first, Trevor. How important is it, or is it not, that essential ICT vendors or suppliers are considered trustworthy and secure?
It's absolutely important, John, and I've got some bad news for you. And that is that trust is hard, and it, of course, doesn't easily scale. But I would say it's essential, right? I mean, you need trust if you're going to take a vendor and take their products that could literally take down your grid. You need trust to ensure that that's not going to happen. So one of the methods that we use at Schneider Electric to build trust is independent certification, right, and verification of our products. And we were actually one of the first vendors, I think the first vendor, to participate in the U.S. Department of Energy's Citrix program. And if you guys don't know what Citrix is, it's essentially just stands for the Cybersecurity of Industrial Control Systems. And it's a program that DOE started in 2020 where they actually select our products. We don't get to select them for them. They select our products that are systemically significant to the U.S. grid, and then they do a full teardown. They do penetration testing on the products, again, of their choosing, to understand what the risk profile of those products might be before they go into utility environments. So that's something that we've used, again, since 2020 that's been very successful. But I'll point out that that's extremely labor intensive on the part of the Department of Energy, the relevant labs, as well as Schneider Electric. And that's why I say, trust is hard and it doesn't easily scale. You can't do that for every single vendor in the ecosystem. You can't do that for every single product in our portfolio. You need to be very selective in how you do that so that you gain trust where you can, because, again, it's very difficult to scale.
Thanks. So trust is hard. It's also not free, right? It sounds like it is not free at all. Miho, I know you wanted to also weigh in on this question of trustworthiness.
Sure. So the trustworthiness is so crucial in the ICT supply chain. Why? Because not everybody in this room or outside of the room uses ICT technologies every single day. For universities, of course, for studies and research, can you imagine to do any research or innovations without ICT technologies? No. And the government? Of course, you have to use technologies to move forward your country. and the industry, us, we have to use ICT for innovations. Yeah, we cannot survive without ICT. So it is that the ICT, the trustworthiness, is a linchpin of our daily lives, business operations, and national security, or even the collaborations among everybody. And I'm so encouraged to see that lots of people in this room right now, because you must be exhausted after a long day, but everybody believes in trustworthiness. So Trevor, you said that it is hard to scale the trustworthiness. It is so true, 100%. But it is still encouraging, and I'm so happy to see everybody believes in and leaning forward to the trustworthiness, because we have the trust in ICT, and we have trust in collaboration between the government and industry, academia, and also between the countries. So that is why that I think that even though that again we live in a really difficult world with a lot of tensions, divisions between countries, even within our country, but still that everybody cares about trustworthiness. So I think that's good, and we can use this Cyber Week to move from here.
If I may, sorry.
Give me one second. I wanted to just go to Shani first, and then we'll go to you.
So in Israel, we look at the Pareto principle in this case, which in my opinion is not just for Israel, it's for every nation. The 20% of the suppliers, mainly the IT, integration, web hosting, cloud, those are the suppliers that representing 80% of the protection of essential organizations. The reason is that every essential organization is using those suppliers, those kind of services. So we would like to also reach the additional suppliers, such as lawyers' offices and the accountants, more than just the technology ones. The NCD defined the essential suppliers, in our point of view, it's a supplier that interface with the organization through a computer, using a computer systems, or alternatively, holding sensitive information that can endanger the organization by getting to the wrong hands. So an example for it, in Israel, we had an attack in December 2020 on a very big insurance company that revealed a lot of personal information about the employees of the government. So this is like a very big stuff for us to look at.
Thanks. Dineshwar, I know you wanted to get in, and so
Just real quick.
please do comment, but also if you want to talk about trustworthiness in the context of the software supply chain.
The answer is going to be the same, because if we've survived COVID, right?
Okay. Well.
So I think I personally owe big thanks to NTT and Schneider Electric, as well as the government regulators and the policy providers, because on 8th March 2020, when we were like Santa Clara County, where I live, we were the first county to shut down. And the first question we had to solve for, how are we going to work, right? So that the question of trust for our hardware suppliers, as well as software developers, as well as the policymakers, as well as everybody in the supply chain, they put together a fantastic job. And I think the vendors did an amazing job as we scaled. We never thought we will be working from home for the next 2 years. So as we go back to office, that trust is kind of has validated that we can scale and survive pandemic or any black swan events like this. Thanks.
Sure. Emma, I don't know if you want to get in on the trustworthiness question. I think you've already mentioned, I think, some of the criteria that the UK government is using. You mentioned the cyber assurance framework. Anything else you wanted to flag, or any other comments on the trust conversation that we're having?
Yeah, I think trust means different things to different people, and so I think it is important that you contextualize how you think of trust and what a trusted vendor or a trusted product looks like. So I mentioned the cyber assessment framework, which provides some level of assurance for those within what we call critical sectors. At the other end of the spectrum, we have an accreditation scheme called Cyber Essentials and Cyber Essentials Plus, and we mandate that any supplier to the UK government needs to meet the Cyber Essentials standard, which designs out a lot of the low-level risk. But I think what is really important across the board is transparency. And making sure that buyers can make informed decisions based on their own risk posture and their understanding of what matters to them and their organisation. So, we have the frameworks in place and, you can choose what is most appropriate to you, but actually having the transparency and the information available to make that choice, I think is probably the most important thing in terms of trust.
Thanks. Maybe actually to stick with you on kind of a somewhat related question, and we've heard about it a little bit, and maybe everyone has thoughts on this, but we always hear about, well, should we use voluntary frameworks? What about regulation in this area? Should it be a mix? Again, just for everyone in the audience's awareness, like the cyber assessment framework, is that a voluntary framework or is that a hard regulatory framework? NIS is regulations, right? So is that a good example of the mix that you have in the UK?
Yeah, definitely. We want to make sure that we apply the right levers proportionate to the risk. So NIS covers our critical sectors, and the cyber assessment framework is used as a mechanism to demonstrate that those within those sectors are meeting the requirements of the regulation. But we think that CAF is a really good framework that should be rolled out more broadly across industry, and that would be on a voluntary basis. But it would provide supply chains and customers with the confidence that certain requirements have been met. So, there's absolutely a place for regulation. Another example would be where we are trying to remove some of the burden from individuals or smaller organisations, and this is a theme that we were hearing from Kemba earlier around the approach that the US is taking, as outlined in their strategy that was published in March. But in another sort of part of the forest, we have just passed legislation which legislates for manufacturers of connected consumer devices and requires them to meet certain standards and implement security by design, removing that burden from the individual and the consumer, so that consumer, when they go to market and buy whatever it is, knows that certain security conditions have been met. So that's where we think regulation is really important, both in removing that expectation of every individual and every small organisation becoming a security expert, but also making sure that where we use regulation across our organisations, it is where we are most concerned about the risk. But we think that the tools that we are using within those regulated sectors are equally applicable across other parts of industry as well, and we'd really like to encourage the uptake of it, as Shani was saying, in terms of some of the work that INCD is taking across the Israeli market.
Thanks. Anyone else want to weigh in on regulation? Trevor, can we regulate trust?
So much. Good,
So the organizations in Israel are classes to several types of organizations according to their level of significance and economic and defense continuity. Most significant are the critical straight infrastructures and essential services that either due to the effect of the cyber attacks that can happen on them, or because of the potential impact on the public consciousness. So in addition, there are government ministries that have regulation either that in the sectors that are estimated to be essential and most significant and influence on the state's resilience, such as Ministry of Health, Ministry of Transportation, Ministry of Energy, and etc. There is the rest Israeli market that are not having the regulation, but they are recommended to use the standard that we're publishing. An example of an attack, of such an attack, in March 2019, in Israel, of course, the Accessibility Act requires the websites to display the information about them in an accessible manner of people with disabilities, to people with disabilities. The mass deployment of accessibility dedicated software in multiple websites created an opportunity for Anonymous, if you know the group, who managed to replace a plugin that many websites added with a hostile code, who destroyed 1 million Israeli pages. That was one of them was a very familiar newspaper here that have hundreds of thousands of subscribers. So yeah, this is
Thanks. Trevor, I know you're
Sure.
dying
yeah.
to get in on this
Well,
one.
you know, you can tell by my title, I'm the regulatory guy, right? So this is all I do all day, and I'm steeped in global regulations, you know, on a daily basis. So I would say, you know, the company line on regulations is we love all regulations. All regulations are wonderful. But I want to just paint the picture of complexity, right, that the regulatory environment introduces for multinationals, especially in the supply chain security context. So imagine for a second that you're the CISO of a multinational, and you have perfectly secured your entire ecosystem, right? Your internal operations, your supplier operations, you even work with your customers to ensure where you have got products deployed, they're deployed securely. And then you introduce trade control. You might ask, well, what is trade control? If you're a cybersecurity expert, you don't know what trade control is. But these are things like export controls, right? So you have this completely secure environment in this hypothetical world. And then all of a sudden, the US government tells you you cannot export certain technologies to existing customers in other nations. And if you do so, you're going to face penalties. And if you do so, you're going to face reputational consequences that then, of course, affect your ability to supply relevant customers. I'll give you an example. It's not an export control necessarily. Well, there are export controls on these companies, but what I'm talking about in this particular context is a law. So in 2018, 19, I can't remember when Section 889 was born, but Section 889 is a provision in the National Defense Authorization Act from the United States that effectively says you cannot sell to the US government if you're doing business with certain China-based vendors. I won't name those vendors here. What's interesting about that is China then released something called the Unreliable Entity List. And what this essentially is, it's saying if you do anything to abide by a law of another country that in any way affects negatively Chinese interests, we can put you on essentially a blacklist. So you've got these two regulations in the supply chain security space that are running counter to one another. And so if you have, you know, customers in both markets, you have to really make a choice. What markets are you going to serve and how? Because you can get caught in a situation where if you're in both markets, you're actually in legal jeopardy. So a very interesting way that the regulatory world, I would say, enhances the complexity of the supply chain security story.
Yeah, thanks for that, Trevor. And maybe just to, you know, you spurred a couple of comments in my mind. I mean, you know, number one, just to add another layer on the 889 issue, which I think is 18, goes back to 2018. Maybe even further back. It's hard to keep up. But you know, it's also the case that even without that second layer, that, you know, the Chinese retaliatory measure, if you will, if you want to call it that, the reality is if you're a global company, you know, there are no other vendors available in certain parts of the world. So if you want to continue doing business and serving those parts of the world, you can't because of some of these regulations. So, you know, again, it creates an interesting set of questions as to what the purpose really is. But the one other thing I wanted to mention, because you mentioned it gets very complex very quickly. You know, I mentioned at the outset that I've been co-chairing this task force for over the past 5 years. It's really looking at these issues. And one of the things that we did, it was one of the first things we did, and we just kind of did a second version of it. But just looking at the U.S. government space, we really wanted to take an inventory of sorts on the different supply chain related regulations across the US federal government. And it's 30 something right now. And frankly, there's not even necessarily awareness all the time of one agency has an initiative that is overlapping potentially with another regulatory initiative. So it really does. And then if you multiply that by however many countries there are in the world, you can see what we're dealing with here. So thanks. Did anyone else have any other comments on regulation that you wanted? I know you mentioned regulation earlier, Dineshwar. So
I think I'll go back to Aid's comment. He mentioned about crown jewels, right? So as we look into what are we going to protect, in there we also need to kind of trust that these are the right crown jewels that we need to protect. We need to constantly keep reviewing, and of course with the regulatory frameworks as well as the industry requirements. And that kind of helps us to kind of not only find and fix vulnerabilities, but also prioritize and make sure we do the right thing every time.
thanks. Anyone else on this? Or Miho, I see you reaching for a mic. So.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So it's really complex in terms of how to be trustworthy in the ICT supply chain risk management. So that is why I think that it is so important for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce actually put this together, because lots of many of us are actually working in an international domain, not just in a single countries. So we have to balance between the different regulations and different policies and different strategies. And it is difficult to how to swim between different regulations. So that is why the U.S. Chamber of Commerce or the ITI, John works at, and that's so crucial, because you know how to work with different governments. And also you know how to work with different global tech companies and suppliers and vendors, and you have relationship, right? Because, well, it's the strategy and regulations are not just on the document. You also have to have a personal relationship, and you also have to have an institutionalized trustworthiness and trusted relationship. But then also everything is reliant on the personal level first. So I think I'm so grateful that the U.S. Chamber of Commerce knows the importance of the trustworthiness, but also the ICT supply chains, and put together this panel, and inviting different countries and also from the government, industry, and also trade associations. Then we can sometimes we have a different opinions, and we do not agree with everything, but that's okay, I think. Maybe you have different views from the government, but and I think that it's so important to have different views and to work with the government and the industries and academia on this issue.
Yeah, thanks. And I mean, you've mentioned a couple of times, Miho, kind of the international collaboration dimension. I mean, look, as you point out, from the ITI perspective, it's so important. Ian and I chatted about that a little bit earlier. I do wonder, if anyone else has thoughts on international collaboration opportunities that may exist. Whether it's government to government. I think the U.S. and the U.K. have had some bilateral discussions on this even, or whether there are opportunities in multilateral for the G7, the OECD. There are things going on in other regional. There's a focus on supply chain and other regional mechanisms as well. The EU-US Trade and Technology Council is one. The Indo-Pacific Economic Framework is another one that comes to mind. The Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, which involves, there's a lot going on. And in the recent cyber strategy released by the U.S., it does kind of tee up that the U.S. government at least has a perspective, but we want to try to figure out how to leverage these various different mechanisms. So I just wonder if any of the panelists have thoughts on what you think is the potentially most fruitful way to go about international collaboration. Trevor, I see you now. You want to jump in on that?
I'll start. I just want to provide a few examples, I would say, of successful international collaboration, some recent examples. So, and I'll tie them back to our topic here. which is, I've said that trust is hard and it doesn't scale easily, but there are certain markers of trust that certain governments are deploying. And I would say a first mover in this space is actually Singapore, right? They came up with their consumer, I think it was their consumer IoT labeling scheme for cybersecurity. And what we're seeing now is actually mutual recognition being developed in other countries where if you certify certain products to a related standard, you can have that mutual recognition between Singapore and the other nations. So they've signed agreements, I think Singapore has, with Finland, Germany, and maybe others. And so now there's talk of a US cybersecurity voluntary IoT labeling scheme. And then you've got the CRA, the Cyber Resilience Act in Europe. And there are conversations, at least preliminary conversations, between the US and Europe about mutual recognition between those two schemes. So I think that's the type of international collaboration that can actually reduce costs for vendors. They can certify once in one geography, but then have mutual recognition in another to still gain market access in that particular geography. And that's very useful, I would say, not just for the vendor community, but also reduces complexity, I would say, for the buyers, right? And all at the same time, building in attempting to scale trust in that process.
Thanks. Anyone else on international collaboration? Emma?
I was just going to agree really that I think government-to-government relationships is obviously really important in making sure that you are aligned in terms of expectations and asks, but what is really important is bringing industry and academia around the table as well. And I think that in doing so, you can have a really fruitful conversation about how we can have that sort of coherence in terms of what we are asking. And to kind of give an example, there are probably a handful of managed service providers that across many of our respective countries we think are critical in terms of the role that they play and the customer base that they have. And from a UK perspective, we've been doing quite a lot of work to engage with international partners, both across governments and with industry, to try and align in terms of our engagement and the expectations which we are asking of those managed service providers, to try and make sure that we are simplifying the landscape. And I mentioned earlier that we are talking about what government's role might be in mitigating some of the risks associated with software across its use life cycle and within supply chains. And we will absolutely not be coming up with something new. We will be drawing on existing standards that are already out there and thinking about how we might be able to use them or enshrine them in how we operate within the UK, whether that is regulation or something else. So I think it's really, really important to learn from best practice, and everything that we are doing from a UK perspective is trying to draw on what's already happening and making sure that we are aligned as far as possible in terms of our expectations of industry. Because the absolute opposite of what we want to do is, make the UK an unattractive place to invest and do business. And so the only way that we can make sure that we are operating across a global stage is making sure that we're aligning with partners. So it's the absolutely kind of central tenet of everything that we're doing.
Yeah, thanks for that. As someone who's been working on a public-private partnership task force for the past 4 years, couldn't agree more on the importance of the public sector and the private sector working together, as well as governments working together, and hopefully everyone working together on these issues. I think one of the and at least in my experience, not only in the U.S. but in talking to others, I think there's a recognition amongst governments that these ICT supply chains are really complex, and things like managed services providers, it's hard enough even for private sector entities sometimes to gain insight into some of these large complex supply chains, even if they're involved in them, and the government knows they need the industry insights as well. And so I think it's a good thing that there seems to be more collaboration happening. I do wonder. Does anyone can anyone cite any other public-private initiatives that are going on in other countries, or not?
If I may,
Sure, finish one.
I'll just talk about when you look at software, it is that one language. There's no cultural difference. It's the same lines of code, get, put, post, APIs. They're going to be giving the same results anywhere you do it. So I think one request that I have for the government regulators is that rather that this is going to help all of us as a practitioners is I'm operating in one part of the globe and I'm giving that information and providing the bombs and bomb scrubs and everything else that goes on. And in the same thing I'm doing in another part of the world, I have to do the same whole thing all over again. There should be some translation available, some frameworks that can help, that the governments or regulatory agencies can come and help us, so that the transaction is translated the same way as software is universal.
Yeah, I mean, Trevor mentioned earlier the importance of mutual recognition. I mean, there is a common language out there. It's international standards, right? Even if different governments have slightly different requirements, but they're pinned to the same shared international standards, it at least it helps at least, right? It would be great if everything was the same. That's probably unrealistic, though. I think we're doing. How are we doing on time? We're still good. Okay. What is your estimation as to the current state of supply chain security in each of your countries, and how do you see it evolving in the coming years? Shani, maybe start with you on this one.
So today the existing situation is not ideal. There are still many attacks through the supply chain on organizations. Our ambition is that in the near future, we'll see much more suppliers that are implementing the methodology that we built in the INCD. Due to the awareness of the significant increase in the attacks on their organizations through their suppliers, and due to the regulation, of course, we published over the critical infrastructures or the government ministries. Since the methodology we publish is graduated to accommodate each size of supplier, so we are expected them to take it with open hands and implement the methodology. And then we hope that the list of the secure suppliers will grow. The fundamental assumption that we're counting on is that the demand will influence the supply. So we'll hope it will be better in the near future. Thank you.
Trevor, I know you're currently living in the U.S. and you're working for a French multinational, and I happen to have inside information that you're moving to Brussels. So I'm going to let you pick any of those countries that you'd like to comment on the state of things, or all of them, if you'd like.
I've got three options. Yeah, but you can tell by my accent I'm certainly an American, and I'll say that I see, unfortunately, a dark future in front of us as it pertains to supply chain security. I think it doesn't strike me as particularly sustainable for the U.S. government to have a posture, and you're going to hate me for saying this, to have a posture of every single time a popular Chinese company comes around of just banning it, right? And I think of the TikTok ban that's being contemplated at the federal level, potentially at different state levels. I think Montana actually passed a TikTok ban. And, Americans put out more information on American platforms than they do on TikTok, so I don't really understand why TikTok is riskier than, Facebook or Twitter. It's very inflammatory to say in the United States, so hopefully no one's listening to this. But it doesn't strike me as a particularly sustainable model. So I was talking to actually an Israeli colleague this morning, and he said, wouldn't it be great if we got to a point in security by design where it doesn't matter the nationality of a particular vendor, right? It doesn't matter where the developers are, but you've deployed a zero trust model inside your network where if something goes wrong, you can just shut everything else down and protect the rest of the network. I mean, that's, I think, at least the theory of zero trust. It's not operational in a lot of cases. It's unfortunately still more theoretical. But that's kind of the world I hope for, right? One that is less tense. And I do tend to think that a world that's just focusing on nation-state bans puts us closer to conflict and less towards true global relations that I think would be better for the entire world.
Couldn't agree more on that topic. I mean, for a long time, ITI has been talking about, developing, objective, fact-based, risk-based approaches, in this area, as opposed to just over-indexing on geography. I mean, country of origin is a risk factor, but it is not the sole dispositive risk factor. I mean, we all know there could be an insecure server sitting under that chair right there, right? It doesn't matter where it's located necessarily. And again, the ICT Supply Chain Risk Management Task Force did a very exhaustive, chronicling of the entire, supplier, global ICT supply chain threat space, and just related to suppliers alone, chronicled 188 different threats. Country of origin was one of them. So we really shouldn't be ignoring the other 187 either. I think is also implicit in your comments there, Trevor. Anyone else have thoughts on this question?
Sure. So because I'm from Japan, so I direct to talk about what Japan is doing. So the Japanese government enacted the new Economic Security Promotion Act last year, and two of the four main pillars is about actually supply chain risk management. Another one is about the protection of critical infrastructure. And this year, the Japanese government is releasing new regulations to do supply chain risk management for the ICT supply chain risk management for critical infrastructure companies. So I'm so glad that the Japanese government is acknowledging the importance to do a better job about the ICT supply chain. However, because now we all know that we have already using the last 2 hours, the supply chain risk management is not just a domestic issue, it's international. So even so Japan has to do a better job, but we have to do a better job about international collaboration with other countries.
Thanks. Emma, you and Ian have already provided, I think, the UK perspective, but any other thoughts on just maybe what the future holds as we look forward?
Yeah, I think that we need to get better, like knowledge is power, right? So we need to get better at supporting organizations to understand their supply chain risks. So, I talked through the kind of abysmally low stats across our business population earlier,
Right.
In terms of visibility of both immediate supply chain risks and below tier one. And it has to start with us, right? So from a government perspective, we are supporting our critical sectors to identify their vulnerabilities. And as I said, we're hopeful that we will be able to bring critical dependencies in scope of legislation, but thinking about what more we can do to support organisations to understand and assess their risk, I think is a really important first step. So, I would hope that in the near future we are able to at least improve awareness, because awareness is obviously the first step in terms of then being able to mitigate the risk. But it feels like we shouldn't underestimate how difficult a challenge that first step is.
Thanks. Dineshwar, any thoughts on this one?
Again, a very operational aspect. I just want to mention, I mentioned about awareness. I think that's the most important part, because as businesses talk about supply chain, we need to empower our developers, our producers, and manufacturers, or architects, not only look into secure design or secure by design, secure coding, or secure testing review and all, and certification, validation, and monitoring and feedback and all that. Words that we talk about in cybersecurity, but there's always somebody in your office who's going to take that flash drive and stick it in the machine. There'll be always somebody who's going to click on that phishing link. So awareness is important. I think we just need to kind of use the mRNA technique of changing our DNA to educate our folks that security is everybody's responsibility. We need to be aware. And as Emma mentioned, knowledge is power.
Thanks. Are we still 15 minutes? Okay. I don't know if I think we I think Ian and I were very efficient at the front end of this, but maybe I will exercise the moderator's prerogative. Maybe to just ask one final question, and then we'll turn it over for our closing keynote. You know, and I think it was you, Dineshwar, who brought up the pandemic and the COVID-19 pandemic. You know, one of the interesting things. I think we all learned a lot of lessons during the pandemic, but there were lessons learned for ICT supply chains as well, right? You know, and in particular, I think it's probably a very well known that there was a sudden global semiconductor shortage, and there was a lot of discussion suddenly about supply, you know, the concept of resiliency and the need for supplier diversity and the need to also even for inventory management practices and a whole variety of things. But you know, at least I have observed since then that policymakers too are talking not just about supply chain security, but much more about supply chain resiliency. So I just wonder if any of the panelists have thoughts on resiliency versus security in this context, how the two concepts relate together. I mean, Trevor, I think that, you know, when we talk about resiliency, you know, this is where country of origin or region is relevant, of course. So again, anyone thoughts on resiliency versus, is it good that we're talking about resiliency as well as security these days?
Yeah, I mean, they certainly dovetail or go together. I mean, I would just quickly say that, you know, to add the geopolitical element to it, it's important that you game out and scenario plan different geopolitical flashpoints, right, that could have an impact on your supply chain, so that you can build contingency plans, right? So you can build diversity in your supply base that are not focused on a single geographic location. So very, very important, I would say, from a U.S. government policy standpoint, and you think you're seeing that throughout the world.
Thanks. Anyone else? Resiliency? Okay.
Oh, yeah, you can go ahead. Okay. So it's hard to choose between resiliency versus security.
I'm not saying you need to choose. They're
Oh,
both important.
I don't have to choose. Then can I take both of them?
Yes, you
Sure.
can go with both. That's fine.
And so, from the perspective of the critical infrastructure company, I think that it's so important to protect the critical infrastructure services, and you have to have both resilience and security in the physical domain and also cyber domain. Why? Because we all know that it is impossible to prevent all the risks, right? There's no such a thing as zero risk. And then we have to counter different types of risks to like natural disasters, and the system breakdown, and also like geopolitical tensions and conflict, or even a real war. So that is why that we have to have a resilient, but we also have to pursue security in the physical and cyber domains, and especially after the war started in Ukraine, the physical security is getting more important than ever. We had never realized the crucialness. So that is why so my company started out as a telecom company based in Japan, but NTT is also like an ICT service provider, and one of our subsidiaries called NTT AT actually provides training sessions on ICT supply chain for our major contractors. Because we have a lot of experiences on how to deal with ICT supply chain risk management, even though we still struggle with it. So that we share our knowledge to the major contractors to share our experiences.
Thanks.
COVID really kind of tested the resilience, not only our ICT supply chain, but also my marriage too. So if I survive that, yeah, the biggest thing is I think we've been talking about frameworks, zero trust, attack surface, and all that, and the diversity of supply chain is important. But we have to make a decision: is it going to be, as we prioritize our products, we have to look at into what can we diversify. Like I'll give you a simple software example, right? So if you want to do containerization, do I do containerization to everything or something where I need to be containerized? Or if you look at an IoT car, and if you open the hood of it, it's essentially all of the corporate network inside one car. You have IDS, IPS, everything is working in harmony to going together. So with that said, and AI is going to play an important part. Do I kill the grandma on the walk or do I protect the kid in the back, right? So it's all of the things are going to have kind of working together, as Miko pointed out properly, rightfully. They have to work in concert, and so that we can survive another black swan event. If I hope it never comes, but that's what we require. Thanks.
Thanks. Emma, any parting thoughts on resilience or anything else?
I think just to echo what everyone else said, that I think cyber is one aspect of resilience, and it is really important that we continue to think of it in that way, and that we support organisations in thinking about risk management across all of the different risks, and that we embed cyber as part of that kind of broader consideration of risk management and resilience, rather than trying to kind of sideline it, or not sideline it, sort of siphon it off as something distinct and separate.
Thanks. Shani, anyone else? Any parting thoughts? No? All right, well, why don't we leave it there? Please join me in thanking our great panel here. Thank you. And now I will turn the podium over for our closing keynote. Itai Glick, the Vice President of Product for UpSWAT. And apparently we're doing a picture as well. Should I get in here? Give me time to set up.
Thank you.
I need to clean up. Thank you.
Nice job. I think this is yours also. Somebody's.
Yeah, that actually.
That's true, John.
I've left a mess here. So.
Okay, everybody. So I'm very honored to be here speaking after the great panelists that we had. I actually think it's fascinating to see the different threats coming in and how we start to... Okay. So it's fascinating to see the different threats coming in. We have two major, in the world today, two major cybersecurity or cyber attackers organizations. We mentioned earlier China and Russia. They're in the aim to attack almost all the organizations. Now, just as a note, I'm Itai Glick. I've been in the Israeli intelligence unit for more than 7 years, mostly as a hacker, following that in different other locations. And I've, let's say, devoted my life to protect organizations for the last 20 years from cyber attacks. So for me, it's fascinating to see where the world is turning in. And for me, there is hope, because all of these people over here talking were from government and regulations. And we even saw Schneider Electric, which really talk about how they protect what they provide to critical infrastructure organization. Interesting to see that the statistics say that 9 out of 10 organizations are attacked by nation states. Now, when you're talking about critical infrastructure organization, that would be probably 10 out of 10. So every critical organization is being targeted by an attacker. And the way for a nation state to attack an organization would always be via supply chain, because this is how they get very high coverage to different organizations at once. So we can
name a few of them. Lenovo, which was, maybe not. This is part of the problem in supply chain. You don't really know in some cases if it was somebody nation state behind it or not. You have CC Cleaner, you have Medoc, which is what not Pata, which is a specific document program. Then you have Supermicro, another great example of supply chain attack. SolarWinds in 2020, mentioned it earlier. Kaseya in 2021, and we have Energetic Bear targeting really applications that are used by energy companies in the world. As the notion of bear usually note that this is a Russian entity. And anybody knows which one was last week? So we had MoveIt. And you have MoveIt, which was last week. British Airlines, British Airways were attacked by it, and a bunch of other. What we see is the trend of the attackers moving from general purpose, specifically in Medoc, to actually, if you see SolarWinds and Kaseya, to actually security tools. So you have Kiteworks, Furious Back, which are now named Excellion. You have Pool Secure, which are now named Ivanti. You have Cisco with the latest VPN problem. You have Barracuda with another mention of a vulnerability in their email. So the protectors become the target of the supply chain attack. So there are a lot of challenges. I won't do it long. The growing sophistication of the attacks is amazing. And one of the risks that we have is actually if you have a nation state attacking, when they are discovered, all of their tools become common knowledge. When that is common knowledge, you get more attacks in the second wave even that you fought at the beginning. Then you have a no single point of failure that needs to be fixed. When you have an organization, a critical infrastructure organization, there are a lot of points you need to make sure that are protected. There is no one place you say, okay, I fixed this and now everything is good. No, you need more than 100 different solutions to protect your organization, and that's crazy. That's a challenge for every organization in whatever scale. And in some cases, to make it even more complicated, the network are segregated or even isolated, so you don't see everything. You have islands in your organization of network, so you don't know what's going on in that areas. And my prediction at this stage is that the next attack is already in the wild. We don't know about it, but there is a nation state attack right now going on. We'll know about it in 3 months, 6 months, that hacked something, some critical infrastructure organization. The definition of critical infrastructure actually is huge. It ranges from finance to education to defense to government, chemicals, everything. You cannot almost find anything other than maybe lawyers that are not critical infrastructure. Okay, so this is the challenges. And finally, as a summary, I think that the world needs an holistic end-to-end solution that protects it from end-to-end, starting from the hardware or the compute if you're in the cloud, to the OS level, to the developer. And when we are talking about the developer, it's not only the code that he writes, it's also the machine that he works on. Because if this machine is compromised, the code could be changed later on. If somebody hijacks the CI/CD pipeline, like we've seen in some of the cases, again, the program that he creates might introduce a vulnerability. Third party and open source like Log4j that was mentioned earlier, and third party all over are a very big vulnerability for organization. And one of the interesting things about this, and I think one of the good things that have been done in the last few years, is by CISA, the known exploited vulnerability. If you do not do anything in the organization, do one thing: take care of known exploited vulnerabilities. Take care of them, you will be more protected than anything else. Only that. One thing I would recommend, make sure you're doing it. Know your assets that you have in the organization. Know the country of origin for all of your assets. Make sure you're doing vendor assessment questionnaires to your vendors. When you're talking about a vendor, you start with legal documents. Vendor looks at you seriously. They need to comply to it because they risk their own business. So you're all in the game together. So you put the responsibility on them as well. Extreme belief in encryption. Encrypt everything, everywhere, whenever. Don't trust anything. I worked with one of the biggest banks in the US, and the CISO told me one thing: I don't trust a firewall. You cannot put a compensating control by using a firewall, because the firewall might be hacked. The firewall might be misconfigured, like Equifax, for example. So you always have something that you need to do. Make sure everything is encrypted, at rest, at move, at transit. And they talked a lot about trust, but in the today world, there is zero trust. When employees want to work outside of the office, the network cannot be trusted. You need to make sure the device can be trusted and put the right mechanisms on it to trust it. And finally, and extremely important, and this is why this is the screen that you see here, constantly monitor your network, all of your security controls, make sure that nothing is irregular. And today, we have artificial intelligence to help us do it effectively. So there are solutions in the market that provide artificial intelligence for security operations. You see a lot of cybersecurity companies going that way. Hackers are also going to AI. This is a different problem, but put inside continuous monitoring so you will be able to see what's going on the spot. And mentioned here regulations. I think adhering to regulations, whether they're UK, whether it's the NIST, whether it's the NERC or FERC or all the other examples of regulations, or the CMMC and the UK Essentials program, all of them are programs that are important. In Israel, we have Torat Hagana, the one talking in Hebrew. So comply to them. They give you the right guidelines. They give you the right prioritization. Mentioning back, KEV, take care of your vulnerabilities. This is the first step in for the organization. And even HIPAA, by the way, requires that every device has an anti-malware running by default. So make sure you know that it's running, not only install it. Make sure you continuously monitor that this device has those compliance inside and ready to be connected to your network. And that's it, guys. Thank you for joining. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Appreciate your time.